I want to share something else that I was able to do, and this wasn't really expected. It was kind of like on the fly. I came up with this idea. So one of the things that Professor Ofer was studying was the Masoretic notes. There are these proofreading notes throughout the manuscript. Some are between the margins and in between the columns, rather, and others are in the upper and lower margin. Now, what happened was, over time, the manuscript, the pages started to be damaged, and they took strips of parchment to reinforce the manuscript. And some of those strips of parchment that reinforced the upper and bottom margin, particularly the bottom margin, covered over some of these notes. So let me show you what I'm talking about. So this is from page 291. And let me get this out of the way here. This is page 291. And we have here a strip of parchment that we believe was added in the 12th century. You can see some writing down here, right at the bottom.
Yes.
Right? But what about the writing that's behind this strip of parchment? Oh, well, you can't see it. So I said, why don't we shine a light behind the back of it? And then all of a sudden you can read it.
Wow, look at that.
Yeah. Isn't that cool?
That is amazing.
Yeah. So, and then you take a photograph and then you can read it. So this is covered with parchment, but we can read it with the backlight, which is pretty cool.
And this is important because that text that you otherwise could not be able to see, that is part of the Masoretic notes, right?
Absolutely. These were proofreading notes that were written in order to make sure the text was copied perfectly, and if there were mistakes in it, you could then correct those mistakes. And I'm not going to go into all the details. It's really a beautiful description of how they work. In the Sotheby's catalog, they have an article online that we'll link to, which has a really good explanation. It was largely based on work by Yosef Ofer, who wrote a very important book, the Masorah on Scripture and its Methods, and he wrote a report for Sotheby's describing it. One of his big discoveries, Professor Ofer, was that there were two Masoretes. There's an original Masorete who wrote notes in the manuscript, and another one came along, erased some of the notes of the first Masorete, and then wrote over the erased sections. And this was why they needed to reinforce the parchment. When they erased it, they damaged the parchment. And so they wrote these new notes over the erasure, and sometimes that bottom and top margin would fall off because the erasing requires, it wasn't with a rubber eraser at the back of a pencil. They took a razor and scraped off ink, and that actually damaged the parchment, and that's why they needed to reinforce it.
Wow.
So the very notes that you wanted to check are the ones that are on the damaged parchment. That's what they're doing there. Now, so Ofer's discovery is that there were two different Masoretes, and so this is a really cool thing. So the second Masorete we know used the Aleppo Codex. And how do we know that? And this is, I think, one of the most significant things about the Sassoon Codex is that there are parts of it that are based on the Aleppo Codex. And why is that important? Because like we said, about a third of the Aleppo Codex is missing. So it is essentially a witness to the Aleppo Codex, particularly the notes of the second Masorete.
Yes.
So on page 112 of the Codex, in the upper margin, there are notes written by the second Masorete, and he has a list of words that are spelled in an unusual way. That's what these lists of notes are. They're lists of different words that are spelled in special ways, in unusual ways, and the purpose is that when you come to copy, you don't say, oh, that's spelled wrong, and you correct it, because you say, yeah, it's part of the list. I know it's supposed to be spelled weird in that place. All right, so here's what he writes. ומצאנו אותם במעשה המלמד הגדול אהרון בן משה בן אשר, במעשיו במחזור המכונה באלתאג'. And we found them in the work of the great teacher, this list he's just quoted, in the work of the great teacher Aharon, the son of Moshe, the son of Asher, literally in his deeds, but meaning in the things that he wrote, in the machzor. Machzor is a word that means a codex,
okay,
a manuscript. Later it means something else, but here that's what it means. which is called Al-Taj, the crown. Now, what does that have to do with the Aleppo Codex? So the Aleppo Codex today is called in Hebrew Keter Aram Tsova, the Aleppo crown. Aram Tsova is actually the biblical name for the Syrian city of Aleppo. It's called the Aleppo crown. And so the manuscript or in the Codex called Al-Taj, which is Arabic for the crown. So there's a manuscript called Al-Taj, and it's the work of Aaron ben Moshe ben Asher, particularly the notes are. That has to be the Aleppo Codex. And so this is actually, well, it depends when this was written. That's where things get a bit complicated.